Alright, let's get to the programming of the line chart. If you haven't watched the first part of the series, I recommend you that you watch it because there we will cover the basics that are needed to draw this line chart. So let's get started. Create a new project and choose app, or it could be single view app depending on whether you have the latest Xcode version or not. You can call it whatever you want. I will just call it SwiftUI charts. Make sure the interface is selected as SwiftUI and the language is set to Swift. Continue, save it somewhere you like. Also set the simulator to the iPhone 11. Press resume on the automatic preview. Let's zoom out a bit. Alright, now the way we are going to draw the line chart is by introducing a shape for it. And I will call it the line graph shape, just like this. And once you do this, Xcode will complain to you because in order to conform to this shape protocol, you have to make sure that you implement the method that is called path. And it takes a rect and returns a path. So to give you an example, if you would have something like a circle, you could get its path in a specific rect, so the rect we get. And then you could already draw it in here in the content view, like so. And if you try to resume, you will see the circle. But what we want is not a circle, we want a set of paths that represents the prices from a certain stock, for example, the Apple stock. And to do that, we have to first declare a variable that contains our data points. Remember, these data points have to be normalized. If you haven't watched the first video, I once again recommend you to watch it, then you will understand what I mean by that. But yeah, these are the normalized points or data points between 0 and 1. Obviously, if you do so, this here will complain because you have to initialize this data points array. So let's just do it with some dummy data. So let's say we have something like 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and 0.6. So this is basically linearly growing till here and then growing really fast on here. Now we can get to the drawing of this line graph. So what we basically want is a path. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to say path. And the cool thing about a path is you can actually access and work with the path inside of the closure. So you can say P, which stands for the current path. You can say P.move to the CG point at 0, so the origin location. And also you could say something like P.add line to, let's say, 100 in the x coordinate and 100 in y coordinate. And if we do that, you will first notice you don't really get to see the line yet. And that is because when you have the path like this, what you have to do in addition is after you call this line graph, you have to say stroke. And once you do that, you can see the line. And here's also the first thing that you notice, and that is really important to understand. In iOS, the coordinate system doesn't start at the bottom left as we are used to. Instead, it starts at the top left corner. So if you increase in Y, we're not going up, we're actually going down. So 100, 100 is really at this point and it's not here. Now with that in mind, let's get to the actual drawing of our chart. So let's remove these example and start with the first case. So we said we have to remove the bad cases from in the first video. And what I meant by this is if we have less than 2 points, there's no point in drawing them. So we just return the initial path, which has no lines. So the way we do it is we simply create a guard statement, and we are going to say data points.count must be greater to 1, else we return the empty path without any lines. Now in this case, we have at least 2 points, right? So we can also access the first point. Now the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to say start is equal to data points at the first position. Notice that I'm accessing it directly using the index. The reason why I'm doing it this way and not this way is because if you say data points start first, it also gets the first element of this array, but what we get is an optional. But in here, I think it's fine since we have the start statement. We are pretty sure there's at least 2 elements. We can easily force unwrap this value from the array and simply say, get me the value at the zeros location. And that way this CG float is not optional anymore. Now that we did that, we can move to the initial location. So it should be at the x coordinate 0 and the corresponding y coordinate of our first data point. So we basically say path.move to the CG point with the x and y. The x is going to be 0 for the first point, and the y is going to be the starting y coordinate times the height of the graph. So the height of the graph we can access like this. Remember, we get the rect, and that's the rect of this line graph. So we simply access it like this. So this is the way we would do it if the coordinate system starts at the bottom left corner. But in iOS, the coordinate system starts at the top left corner, and therefore we have to do a slight modification. So remember, the start value is always going to be between 0 and 1. Remember, this is just as we defined it in our first part of the tutorial. So we take the y coordinate, which the normalized y coordinate, which is between 0 and 1, and multiply it with the height. But there's one small issue that I didn't discuss in the first part, and that is that the iOS coordinate system doesn't start at the bottom left corner like we're used to, but instead it starts at the top left corner. So the y coordinate changes, the x stays the same, x increases the more you go to the right, but the y increases when you go from the top to the bottom. So therefore we have to always, when we calculate with the y coordinate, subtract the start by 1 just to adjust to this new coordinate system. If we would not do this, what actually happens is, even though we have linear numbers, so they're increasing linearly, it wouldn't go upwards from the bottom left to the top right. Instead, it will go from the top left to the bottom right. And with this adjustment, we just fixed this issue. So once we did that, we can start adding the lines. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to say, for index in data points dot indices, we're going to do the following. We're going to say path dot add line. Now here it will get a bit more tricky because we can't simply say x equaling 1, 2, 3. Remember, in the first tutorial I showed you how to calculate the x coordinate, and similarly we have to use the generic formula to find the y coordinate for all of these points. So let's create a helper function for this. Since this helper function that we're going to use is only relevant for this path function, you can actually declare a function inside of a function. So the way we do it is we simply say function point at index, which is an integer, and it returns a CG point. So the point is obviously our data points at that specific index that we got passed. So we say data points at the index. Now for x, we're going to use the formula we got from the first presentation. It's basically the rect width times the CG float of the index divided by CG float dot data points. So the number of data points, so data points that count minus 1. Remember, this was important. We also learned this in the first part of the tutorial. If you haven't watched this, I recommend you again, please watch it. then it will make much more sense. Now we can also calculate the y coordinate. We can simply say let y be equal to, remember whenever we work with the y coordinate, we have to think in the coordinate system of iOS. So first subtract the point from 1 and then simply multiply it with the height. Once we did that, we can return our CG point, which is going to be a CG point with the x and y we just calculated. Now we can go into our for each loop. So for each data point, we are going to say add a line to the CG point that we just calculated for that specific index. So we say add a line to the point at index idx like this. Now, since we have a function, the path is not the only thing. We have to make sure that the return key is there. So once we do this, we should have our line graph, as you can see here. Actually, let's make it a bit more clear by setting a border around it. The way we're going to do it is we simply say border with the color black. Let's also set a frame for it. Maybe a similar frame we had in the first part of the tutorial. Let's say 300. Well, actually, I think the width was 400 and the height was 300. We don't really need an alignment here. And then, as you can see, here you have the border and here there's a line graph. And just to make the point clear, if you had the 0 here, the graph would start here. And similarly, if you had the 1 here, this is our max, this represents our maximum value, we would end up here. So as I told you earlier, we assumed that the line graph takes normalized value, but obviously the stock prices don't come to us in a normalized form. So I would also like to show you how you can easily normalize any array of prices into values between 0 and 1. Now for this I prepared mock data so we can actually see this better in action. So for that I would like to create a new file because it's going to be a bit huge. Let's just call this file chart mock data. And then inside of this file, we're going to define a struct like so. And we will have a static variable that contains our data. And in this case, I will just use the data I collected. I will put it into the description. You can download it and try it yourself. Since we're using CG float here, you have to make sure that we import SwiftUI. Here I'm using CG float, but a double would be fine too. So don't worry about that at this point. Now, if we would try to go back to the content view and say, all right, don't draw these points, but instead draw the chart mock data .1 month, you would run into an issue because if you try to resume this, you will see nothing, and that is because our numbers are really high. Remember, when we're drawing, we want numbers to be between 0 and 1, and these numbers are much higher than 0 and 1, so you will never see them here. So what we have to do is we have to normalize them, and since this here is basically an array of CG float, we can create a nice handy array extension that will take care of normalization of this array. So let's create that extension. That extension is going to be an extension on the array where the element, so the array element is going to be of type CG float. Now here we assume that the elements of the arrays are CG floats, but you could also say the element should be of type floating point. That way you could also work with doubles. But here I'm fine with this implementation. And then in here we were going to create a small helper function that will return the elements. So returns the elements of the sequence normalized. So the way we're going to implement it is we're going to write a computed property called normalized. It's of type CG float array. And here we calculate, remember the first thing we have to do for the normalization is calculate the minimum and the maximum. So let's do that. If we can get the minimum from self, the current array we have, and also if we can get the maximum of the array we're working with, then return self.map. So we're transforming the array in a way that each of these elements in that array are normalized in place. And the way we're going to do it is, remember the formula from the first part of the video. We take the element that we're working with, subtract it from the minimum of the data set, and we divide it by the maximum of the data set minus the minimum of the data set. Now, if this is not successful, then we don't have a minimum and a maximum. Then we obviously have some small array, maybe an empty array even. Then we just return the empty array because there's no way we can normalize something like that. Now, to access the normalized values, we can simply say chart mock data.1month.normalized. And then when we try to resume, you will see the graph is just like as we wanted. Now to make it a bit more pretty, we could also say instead of just stroke, we could say stroke it with the color blue, and then you will see the change right away. Now this is how you draw stock charts or line charts in general. I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, use the comment section, and I will see you in the next tutorial. Thank you for watching.